On August 19, 1953, a covert operation inside Tehran was already underway.
Further pictures from Tehran show rioters in action, supporters of the aged Dr. Mosaddegh, set about their work of destruction.
Money was changing hands. Newspaper editors were receiving instructions. Military officers were receiving quiet messages. And somewhere inside the city, CIA operative Kermit Roosevelt Jr. was coordinating a plan that would change the future of an entire country. By the end of that day, Iran's elected government would collapse, not through an invasion, not through open war, but through propaganda, political pressure, and covert funding moving quietly through a network of intermediaries. For decades, the details remained buried inside classified intelligence files, but the consequences were impossible to hide. Because the decision made in 1953 did more than remove a prime minister, and it reshaped the relationship between the United States and Iran for the next 70 years. But here's the part most people never hear. The coup was not only about Cold War politics. Hidden inside the story was something even more powerful. Money. Oil money. And later in this investigation, we are going to follow that money to understand why this operation happened at all. But to understand that, we need to step backward for a moment. Back before the coup. Back before the revolution. Back to a moment when Iran stood at the center of one of the most valuable resources on Earth. Oil. In the early 1950s, Iran sat on one of the largest oil reserves in the world. And during the mid-20th century, oil meant everything. It powered factories, it fueled aircraft, it moved ships across oceans, controlled oil, and you influenced the global economy. But there was one problem. Iran did not fully control its own oil industry. That power largely belonged to the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a British corporation that would later become BP. The numbers told a story many Iranians believed was impossible to ignore. Oil was extracted from Iranian land, but most of the profits flowed abroad. Iran received revenue, but critics argued the balance was heavily tilted toward foreign interests. Over time, frustration began to grow, quietly at first, then more openly. And eventually that frustration produced a political movement, a movement led by one man, Mohammad Mosaddegh. Mosaddegh was not a military general, he was a politician, educated in Europe, known for passionate speeches about Iranian sovereignty, and determined to bring the country's natural resources under national control. His plan was simple: nationalize Iran's oil industry, transfer ownership from foreign corporations to the Iranian state. For millions of Iranians, the decision felt like justice, a correction of decades of economic imbalance. But for powerful governments and corporations abroad, the implications were enormous, because nationalizing the oil industry did not simply affect profits. It affected the global balance of energy. Western governments relied heavily on Middle Eastern oil supplies, and the sudden disruption of Iranian production triggered alarm. Britain reacted immediately. Legal challenges, economic pressure, sanctions designed to isolate Iran's oil exports. Yet Mosaddegh refused to reverse the decision. And as the crisis escalated, British officials began seeking help from another powerful ally, the United States. To understand why Washington became involved, you have to understand the political climate of that era. The early 1950s were dominated by one global fear: communism. Washington viewed international politics through the lens of Cold War competition with the Soviet Union. British officials framed the Iranian crisis accordingly. They warned American policymakers that instability inside Iran could allow Soviet influence to expand southward. Iran shared a long border with the USSR. If the country shifted politically toward Moscow, the consequences could reshape the Middle East. Whether that threat was immediate or exaggerated remains debated among historians. But the argument worked. By 1953, the United States had agreed to participate in a covert operation, an operation designed to reshape Iranian politics without open war. And the man chosen to coordinate it was about to arrive in Tehran. The CIA officer tasked with overseeing the operation was Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, and a veteran intelligence officer with experience operating across the Middle East. Roosevelt arrived in Tehran during the summer of 1953. He chain-smoked through planning meetings, speaking in the quiet, measured tone of someone accustomed to being listened to. His mission was not to command troops, it was to create political collapse. The strategy relied on three elements: information, influence, and money. Cash moved through intermediaries. Propaganda circulated through newspapers. Political figures and military officers were encouraged to support the Shah. Demonstrations were organized to create the appearance of chaos. The idea was simple. If enough pressure appeared in enough places at the same time, the government might collapse under its own weight. But the operation nearly failed. The first attempt collapsed. The Shah fled the country, and for a brief moment the entire mission appeared finished. Many in Washington believed the operation was over, but Roosevelt made a different decision. He would try again. On August 19, 1953, events accelerated rapidly in Tehran. Crowds gathered in the streets, some protesting Mosaddegh, others supporting him. Military units loyal to the Shah moved through the city, and by evening the balance of power had shifted. Mossaddegh's government collapsed. He was arrested. Within days, the Shah returned. From the perspective of American intelligence officials at the time, the operation had succeeded. But the success of the operation created a problem no one predicted, because the decision that stabilized Iran in 1953 would help ignite a revolution 26 years later. To understand why, pause for a moment. Imagine you are an Iranian citizen in Tehran that day. You wake to the sound of crowds gathering in the streets. Newspapers that yesterday supported the government now demand its resignation. Soldiers move through intersections you recognize from your daily commute. And by nightfall, the prime minister you voted for is gone. Would it feel like a natural political collapse? Or would it feel like something larger was happening behind the scenes? Because for many Iranians, that question never disappeared. But here is what the planners of that operation in 1953 never predicted. When intelligence officers discussed the coup in Washington, they were thinking in terms of strategy, oil supply, Cold War pressure, regional stability. They were not thinking about how the decision would echo through the psychology of an entire nation. But history rarely moves in straight lines. Decisions made quietly in government offices do not stay quiet forever. Every action in geopolitics creates memory, and memory has a long life. For many Iranians, the events of 1953 never faded into the past. The story was discussed in homes, debated in classrooms, passed between generations as proof that powerful countries could shape the destiny of smaller ones. For years, the resentment sat beneath the surface. Not loud, not explosive, just waiting. Waiting for the moment when pressure would finally break through the system created after the coup. And when that moment arrived, it did not begin with diplomats. It began with people, students, workers, religious leaders, families filling the streets. And when millions of citizens began asking the same question at the same time, even powerful governments struggle to contain what comes next. Because in 1979, something happened that the architects of the 1953 coup had never imagined. The system they helped create collapsed. The Shah's government fell. Mass protests swept across Iran. Millions filled the streets, and the monarchy ended. In its place emerged the Islamic Republic of Iran, led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. For many Iranians, the revolution was not simply ideological, it was also about reclaiming national independence. And almost immediately, tensions with the United States intensified. Later that year, Iranian students seized the American embassy in Tehran. 52 diplomats were taken hostage. The crisis lasted 444 days, and it permanently transformed the relationship between the two countries. What had once been an alliance became open hostility, but the revolution did not end the story. In many ways, it only changed the battlefield.
Iran was no longer a friend and overnight becomes an enemy.
Because when governments cannot fight directly, they often turn to another form of power. Financial pressure, bank accounts, currency systems, international payment networks. And that is where the story shifts again. Because while most people think of conflict in terms of soldiers and weapons, modern geopolitical pressure often moves through something far less visible: money. By billions of dollars moving through global financial institutions, assets frozen with a single instruction, entire economies restricted through decisions made inside banking systems most people never see. When the United States responded to the hostage crisis in 1979, it froze Iran's money. Not millions, billions. Money that had already been earned through oil sales. Money sitting inside international banks. Money that suddenly became leverage in a political standoff. And once financial pressure became part of the conflict, a new kind of struggle began, one that still continues today. In response to the hostage crisis, the United States froze billions of dollars in Iranian assets held in foreign banks. Government funds, gold reserves, financial payments connected to military contracts. And the freeze marked the beginning of a sanctions regime that continues today. Economic restrictions limited Iran's access to international banking systems. Trade relationships became tightly controlled. Financial pressure became a central tool of American foreign policy. And if you follow the money through the decades that followed, you begin to see the same pattern repeating. Sanctions, negotiations, asset freezes, economic leverage used as geopolitical power. By the early 2000s, tensions had shifted toward Iran's nuclear program. Western governments feared that uranium enrichment could lead to nuclear weapons. Iran insisted the program was for civilian energy.
An axis of evil.
Unprecedented, crippling sanctions on Iran.
Iran has been a very dangerous player. They're a nation of terror.
Sanctions intensified. Cyber operations targeted nuclear facilities. Diplomatic negotiations rose and collapsed. But beneath every modern crisis lies the same historical shadow. Because for Iranian leaders, the coup remains proof that foreign governments are willing to intervene in their sovereignty. And for American leaders, the hostage crisis reinforced the belief that Iran is a strategic adversary. Both sides are responding to real events, but both sides are also responding to history. The conflict between the United States and Iran did not begin with missiles, or nuclear negotiations, or embassy hostages. It began decades earlier, with a covert operation, a political gamble, and a decision made far from the streets of Tehran, a decision that reshaped a nation and created consequences that still echo through global politics today. Because sometimes the most powerful battles are not fought with armies. They are fought with influence, with money, with decisions made quietly behind closed doors. 70 years have passed since that day in Tehran, but the system that followed did not disappear. It evolved. Sanctions replaced military pressure, financial leverage replaced direct political control, and the consequences of those decisions continue to shape the present. History does not vanish when documents are declassified. It lingers.
With your adversaries, I do think that you have to have the capacity to put yourself occasionally in their shoes.
In institutions, in policy, and in the memories of the people who lived through its consequences. The files may now be open, but the ripple effects of those decisions are still moving through the world today. Next time on Dark Money Files, we trace the bank accounts behind one of the largest covert military operations in modern history. Because sometimes the most dangerous weapons are not missiles, they are transactions.